Imagine living in an idyllic world where everything is perfect. There's no crime, poverty, or hunger. There's also no war because everyone has the same ideals, values, and way of life. The only drawback to this utopian society is that it is built on the ocean, and one day the entire city sinks beneath the waves. This might sound like a bizarre sci-fi movie, but it's actually the plot summary of Plato's description of the lost city of Atlantis, a place so advanced that it could be mistaken for a fantasy or a dream. But did a city like this really exist? If so, what happened to it? This is the real story of Atlantis, or maybe it isn't. Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher, widely considered to be one of the founders of Western philosophy. He was also, according to legend, a close friend and student of the Greek sage Socrates, who was killed by drinking poison after being convicted of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. Plato wrote extensively on a variety of subjects, including politics, ethics, and metaphysics, but he is perhaps best known for his detailed descriptions of two fictional dialogues, the Republic and the laws in which he describes a perfect society ruled by philosopher kings. The dialogue Republic in particular outlines a utopian society with a highly disciplined military, a classless social structure, and a government run entirely by the smartest people in the city. It's basically Plato's version of Star Trek, except instead of the final frontier. The crew of the Starship Enterprise traveled to new worlds to boldly go where no man has gone before. In Republic, they traveled to the lost city of Atlantis. According to Plato, Atlantis was situated in the Atlantic Ocean, but not too far from the Strait of Gibraltar. The Atlanteans were said to be a naval power, having invented the warship 400 years before Plato's time. They waged war on the Greeks, but their navy was eventually defeated by the combined forces of Athens and Sparta at the Battle of the Salamis Strait. Not long after, the gods became angry at the hubris of Atlantis and sent a great flood to wipe out their civilization. Now, only the ruins of their once great cities are left behind, lost beneath the waves. Okay, let us put aside the fact that all of this sounds an awful lot like the biblical story of Noah's Ark, and that the destruction of Atlantis looks a whole lot like the biblical story of the deluge. Put all of that aside and let's just focus on the geography. If Atlantis was located in the Atlantic Ocean between the Strait of Gibraltar and mainland Greece, then its ruins should still be there, right? Well, not exactly. See, Plato never gave any precise geographical coordinates for the location of Atlantis. All we have to go on is his description of the Atlantic Ocean, which, to be fair, is pretty vague. According to Plato, the coast of Atlantis was surrounded by Pillars of Hercules, which must mean either the Straits of Gibraltar or the Pillars of Hercules monument in Spain. And since Plato described the island as being near the entrance to the ocean, it must have been located somewhere around the Mediterranean Sea, right? Well, not quite. The Mediterranean isn't an ocean, it's a sea. And Plato was talking about the Atlantic Ocean. So, that's a bit of a problem. But wait, there's more. Plato also claimed that the sun was in the exact opposite position when he visited Atlantis than it was when he visited Athens. Since we know that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, this can only mean that Plato visited Atlantis in the southern hemisphere. But if Atlantis was near the Pillars of Hercules, it would have to be in the northern hemisphere. And to add further confusion to this mess, the Atlanteans were also said to have sailed around the entire Earth, which would have been impossible if they had been confined to the Atlantic Ocean near the Pillars of Hercules, unless, of course, Plato was wrong. In fact, scholars now believe that Plato made up the entire story of Atlantis, and there are several reasons why. First of all, Plato was a philosopher, not a historian. He was interested in using stories and examples to illustrate his philosophical points, not in recording actual historical events. For example, Plato used the story of the Trojan War to illustrate his ideas about justice in his dialogue, The Republic. No one thinks that Plato literally believed that the Trojans fought against the Greeks for 10 long years over the body of a slain princess. Plato was using the Trojan War as a teaching tool, and the same is probably true of the story of Atlantis. But what exactly was Plato trying to teach us with the story of Atlantis? Well, according to scholar Barry Powell, Plato may have been using the story of Atlantis to illustrate the difference between wisdom and ignorance. The Atlanteans with their powerful navy and claims of divine ancestry, represent those who think that strength and bloodlines determine wisdom. By contrast, the Athenians represent those who understand that wisdom is earned through knowledge and experience. In short, the story of Atlantis is really just a morality tale. So if Plato invented the story of Atlantis, does that mean that there wasn't a lost civilization in the Atlantic Ocean, somewhere, sometime in the distant past? Not necessarily. After all, Plato based many of his stories on local myths and legends. And there were almost certainly myths and legends circulating about a lost people who lived on an island in the Atlantic Ocean. These stories may have been based on the archaeological reality of an ancient settlement that lay submerged beneath the waves. And we know that there were settlements along the Atlantic coast of Europe during the last ice age, such as those found in the region of Doggerland, which connected Great Britain to continental Europe. But as the ice melted, sea levels rose, and the landmass was inundated. What's more, the oldest known written account of Atlantis comes from a piece of rock art in southwestern Ireland that dates back to around 4200 BC. The rock art depicts two ships wrecked on a beach with the survivors fleeing into the forest. Some scholars believe that this rock art depicts the remnants of a Bronze Age culture that lived on the western European coast until the sea level rise caused by the melting of the polar ice caps. But if there was a prehistoric civilization on the coast of Western Europe, what happened to them? Well, they didn't suddenly disappear. But as sea levels rose, they were pushed farther and farther inland until they eventually adopted a more typical way of life. The people who lived on the North European plain, for example, eventually settled down and began farming. Their descendants are still there today, living in Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands. In other words, the people who lived on the coast of Western Europe didn't drown in the rising seas. They simply adapted and survived. And the same can be said of the people who lived on the island of Crete. During the Neolithic period, the island was connected to the Egyptian coast by a narrow isthmus, which allowed the Cretans to trade with the Egyptians. But as the ice caps melted and sea levels rose, the isthmus was inundated and the Cretans found themselves cut off from the outside world. This forced them to develop their own unique culture, which reached its peak during the Bronze Age when the Cretans formed the Minoan civilization. But as the Bronze Age drew to a close, the Minoans were wiped out by a volcanic eruption on the neighboring island of Thera, also known as Santorini. The eruption threw ash and pumice into the air, blocking out the sun and causing global temperatures to plummet. But the worst of the damage was done locally, where the eruption triggered a tsunami that devastated the Cretan coast. So while the Minoan civilization was not destroyed in a single day by a great flood, their way of life was effectively ended by a series of natural disasters. In the end, then, Plato's description of Atlantis may have been inspired by these real-life events. But it was ultimately a work of fiction designed to illustrate his philosophical ideas. But whether or not there was ever a lost civilization in the Atlantic Ocean remains a mystery. Maybe someday archaeologists will discover the truth of what happened, or maybe the truth is out there somewhere, lost beneath the waves. What do you think? Did a civilization like Atlantis really exist, or is it nothing but a figment of Plato's imagination? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this one. As always, stay curious.